Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the cold stone wall, trying to ignore the sharp pain shooting through her left shoulder. The crash had been 3 days ago, and the emergency medical supplies in her pack were running dangerously low. Her ship, the exploration vessel Perseverance, now lay in twisted metal fragments across a valley she could barely see through the alien mist that covered this world. She had been the medical officer on a routine survey mission when something had gone catastrophically wrong with the navigation systems. The other 12 crew members hadn't made it out of the wreckage. Sarah had tried to save them, working for hours in the smoking remains of their ship, but the internal fires and structural damage had made it impossible. She was alone on an unknown planet, with nothing but basic survival gear and her medical training. The ruins where she had taken shelter seemed ancient beyond measure, massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar, covered in symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly. The architecture was clearly not human, with doorways too tall and corridors too wide for any earthly builder. But it was dry, and it provided protection from the strange purple rain that fell every evening on this world. Sarah was cleaning her wounds with antiseptic when she heard the sound. It started as a low humming, almost musical, coming from deeper within the ruins. Then came the scratching noise like claws on stone, accompanied by what sounded like whispered conversations in a language she had never heard before. Her hand moved instinctively to the emergency beacon clipped to her belt, but she had already checked it dozens of times. No signal. Whatever interference blocked communications on this planet was still active. She was completely cut off from any hope of rescue. The sounds grew closer. Sarah gathered her medical supplies and moved deeper, into the ruins looking for a place to hide. The stone corridors branched and twisted in ways that defied logic, sometimes opening into vast chambers lit by a phosphorescent fungus that grew in intricate patterns on the walls. She had just found what looked like a defensible alcove when they appeared. The creatures were unlike anything in Earth's databases. They stood nearly 8 feet tall on 4 legs that ended in delicate, articulated feet. Their torsos were humanoid but covered in a chitinous exoskeleton that gleamed like polished amber. Most striking were their wings, gossamer thin and nearly transparent, that folded against their backs in complex patterns. Their heads were elongated, with large compound eyes that reflected the fungal light like jewels. Sarah counted at least a dozen of them moving through the chamber with fluid grace. They communicated in that strange humming language she had heard earlier, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the stone itself. One of them spotted her. The creature's head turned toward her hiding place, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, human and alien stared at each other across the ancient chamber. Then the creature made a sound she could only describe as a musical shout, and suddenly all of them were looking at her. Sarah stood, slowly, raising her hands to show she carried no weapons. The creatures surrounded her in seconds, their movements coordinated like a dance. Up close she could see that their exoskeletons were decorated with intricate engravings, and some wore what appeared to be jewelry made from crystalline materials. The largest of them approached her directly. This one was different from the others, not just in size but in bearing. The engravings on its exoskeleton were more elaborate, inlaid with precious metals, and it wore what was clearly a crown of some sort, delicate and beautiful but unmistakably regal. The creature spoke, and its voice was like music, complex harmonies that conveyed meaning even though Sarah understood none of the words. When she didn't respond, it tried again in what sounded like a different language than another. Sarah shook her head slowly. "I don't understand," she said. "I'm sorry, I don't speak your language." The creature tilted its head, studying her, with those large compound eyes. Then it did something unexpected. It pointed to itself and said very carefully, "Zuthara." The syllables were difficult for a human throat, but the meaning was clear enough. "Sarah," she replied, pointing to herself. "My name is Sarah." The alien queen, for that was clearly what she was, seemed pleased by this exchange. She spoke to her companions, who responded with that musical humming that might have been laughter or approval. But then Sarah noticed something that made her medical training take over. The queen was favoring her left side, and there was a strange discoloration visible between her wing joints. As Ithara moved, Sarah caught glimpses of what looked like an infected wound, partially hidden by the complex folding of her wings. Sarah had seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize the signs of serious infection: the discoloration, the way the queen held herself, the slight tremor in her movements. Without thinking, she stepped forward and made a gesture toward the injury, then pointed to her medical bag. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every alien in the chamber went completely still. The queen's compound eyes fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was almost frightening. Sarah realized she might have just made a terrible mistake. She had no idea what cultural taboos she might have violated by pointing at the queen's injury. But the medical training was stronger than her fear. This creature was in pain and Sarah was a doctor. She opened her medical bag slowly, showing each item as she removed it: antiseptic, bandages, a small surgical light, pain medications. She held up each one, trying to communicate their purpose through gestures. The queen watched every movement, with fascination. She spoke to her companions, and Sarah heard what sounded like an argument beginning among them. Some of the aliens seemed angry or concerned, while others appeared curious about the strange items Sarah was displaying. Finally, the queen made a decision. She spoke a single word that seemed to settle the argument immediately, then turned back to Sarah and nodded slowly. Sarah approached carefully, her medical bag in hand. Up close, the injury was worse than she had thought. The wound was located in the complex joint where the queen's wings attached to her torso, in a spot that would be almost impossible for the aliens to reach or treat themselves due to their anatomy. The infection was advanced, caused by what looked like tiny crystalline fragments embedded in the tissue. Sarah had never seen anything like it, but she recognized the signs of foreign body contamination. Something had gotten into the wound, and the queen's immune system couldn't clear it. Working by the light of her small surgical lamp, Sarah began the delicate process of cleaning the wound. She used local anesthetic from her emergency supplies, then carefully removed each crystalline fragment with precision instruments. The queen remained absolutely still throughout the procedure, though Sarah could hear her breathing change as the pain medication took effect. The other aliens watched in complete silence. Sarah had the unsettling feeling that she was performing some sort of ritual without understanding its significance, but her medical training kept her focused on the task: clean the wound, remove the foreign material, apply antibiotic treatment, dress the injury properly. As she worked, Sarah noticed that the crystalline fragments seemed to be moving slightly, almost as if they were alive. She collected them carefully in a specimen container, planning to study them later. Whatever they were clearly the source of the infection. When she finished, the queen's relief was obvious. The tremor in her movements disappeared, and she held herself differently, without the careful guarding of the injured area that had been so apparent before. But instead of gratitude, the queen's reaction was one of shock. She spoke rapidly to her companions, and Sarah heard that musical argument beginning again, more intense this time. The queen turned to Sarah and spoke carefully in what sounded like formal language. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. This was some sort of declaration or pronouncement. One of the other aliens approached and began what sounded like a complicated explanation, using gestures and simple words in what might have been a trade language. Sarah caught fragments of meaning, enough to understand that something significant had just happened. She had cleaned a wound. But according to their customs, she had done something that only one type of person was allowed to do. Only a spouse could touch that sacred area of a queen's body. The chamber erupted into chaos as soon as the queen finished speaking. The aliens began making rapid musical sounds that grew louder and more agitated with each passing moment. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, still holding her medical instruments, completely unable to understand what was happening around her. Queen Ithara raised one of her forearms, and the noise stopped immediately. She spoke again, slower this time, and Sarah caught some familiar sounds. The alien who had tried to explain things earlier approached her again, gesturing frantically. Through a combination of simple words, drawings scratched into the dust on the floor and elaborate pantomime, Sarah began to understand the magnitude of what she had done. In Zephyrian culture, the area between the wing joints was considered the most sacred and intimate part of the body. Only family members could touch it during childhood, and only spouses were allowed contact after maturity. By cleaning the queen's wound, Sarah had unknowingly performed what they called the bonding touch. According to their ancient laws, this made her legally married to the queen and gave her the right to rule alongside her. Sarah tried to explain that she had only been providing medical care, that she had no knowledge of their customs, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But the aliens seemed to think that intention mattered less than action. She had performed the bonding touch, regardless of why she had done it. The queen listened to Sarah's protests with what seemed like patience, then spoke to her companions. Again. This time one of them came forward and began what was clearly a history lesson. Using the same mix of simple words and gestures, the alien explained that the Zephyrians were not originally from this world. They were refugees from a place they called the Golden Spiral, a star system that had been their home for thousands of years. Something terrible had happened there, something that forced them to flee with whatever ships they could manage to build. Sarah learned that Queen Zithara was not just a ruler, but a military commander who had led the evacuation of her people. The wound Sarah had treated was not from an accident but from battle, sustained while fighting something the aliens called the endless hunger. As the alien continued his explanation, Sarah began to understand that the crystalline fragments she had removed from the queen's wound were not natural formations. They were some kind of technology, tiny machines that had been trying to convert the queen's organic tissue into something else. The realization sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She had seen those crystals moving in her specimen container, and now she understood they were not just foreign objects but active threats. Whatever had attacked the Zephyrians was still out there, and those crystal fragments were scouts or advance agents. The alien explaining things to her was introduced as Vexilon, the queen's chief advisor. He seemed genuinely worried about the implications of Sarah's accidental marriage to the queen, but not for the reasons she expected. According to Vexilon, there was another Zephyrian who had been expecting to challenge for the right to marry the queen. Commander Krextul was the leader of the military forces and had been pressing his claim based on his service and noble bloodline. Sarah's unexpected bonding had thrown all of his plans into chaos. As if summoned by their conversation, Commander Krextul arrived in the chamber with a group of warrior escorts. He was larger than the other Zephyrians, with battle scars decorating his exoskeleton and weapons integrated into his armor, his compound eyes fixed on Sarah with obvious hostility. The conversation that followed was clearly an argument, though Sarah could only understand fragments of it. Krextul seemed to be challenging the validity of her bonding with the queen, arguing that an alien could not possibly understand Zephyrian law well enough to be considered a true spouse. Queen Zithara's responses were calm, but firm. Even without understanding the language, Sarah could tell that the queen was defending her right to choose her own spouse and supporting the legitimacy of the bonding. But Krextul had other arguments. He gestured towards Sarah dismissively, then launched into what sounded like a speech about tradition, bloodlines, and the importance of keeping their species pure during their time of crisis. Sarah found herself getting angry as she listened to the tone of Krextul's words. She might not understand the language, but she recognized the sound of prejudice and dismissal when she heard it. When Krextul finished his speech, Sarah stepped forward and addressed the queen directly. "I don't understand your laws or your customs," she said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I don't know what it means to be bonded to you, and I certainly never intended to marry anyone when I cleaned your wound. But I do know that you were in pain, and I helped you because that's what doctors do. We help people regardless of who they are or where they come from." She turned to face Krextul, meeting his compound eyes without flinching. "And I know that whatever drove you from your homeworld is still out there. Those crystal things I pulled out of the queen's wound are still active. They're trying to convert organic matter into something else, and that means you're all still in danger." Vexilon translated her words. and Sarah saw surprised reactions from several of the aliens. Apparently, they had not realized that she understood the nature of the crystalline infection. Krextol's response was skeptical and dismissive, but Queen Zithara seemed very interested in what Sarah had said. She asked several questions through Vexilon, wanting to know more about Sarah's analysis of the crystal fragments. Sarah explained her medical findings as best she could. The crystals appeared to be some form of nanotechnology designed to break down organic compounds and rebuild them into new structures. They seemed to be guided by some kind of collective intelligence, working together to achieve their goals. The Queen's reaction to this information was immediate and alarming. She spoke rapidly to Krextol, who seemed to argue with her about something. Finally, the Queen made a decision and gave what sounded like orders. Several of the aliens hurried away, presumably to carry out the Queen's commands. Krextol looked frustrated, but did not openly disobey. Through Vexilon, the Queen explained to Sarah that the crystals she had described sounded exactly like the advanced scouts of the Endless Hunger. If they were present on this world, it meant that their enemy had found them despite their careful efforts to hide. The Endless Hunger was not a natural phenomenon, but a machine intelligence that converted entire worlds into more of itself. It started with small scout units like the crystals Sarah had found, then sent larger forces to consume everything organic on a planet. The Zephyrians had been fighting this enemy for decades before finally being forced to evacuate their home system. They had chosen this remote world because it seemed to be outside the Endless Hunger's area of expansion, but apparently, they had been wrong. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread as she realized the implications. She was not just stranded on an alien world with strange customs and an accidental marriage. She was trapped on a planet that was about to be invaded by a force that could convert entire worlds into machines. But as she looked around at the aliens who were now apparently her people, Sarah realized something else. Her medical training had taught her to see patterns and solve problems under pressure. Her human perspective might be exactly what the Zephyrians needed to survive. Krextol clearly did not agree. He continued to argue with the Queen, apparently insisting that traditional military tactics were the only way to deal with the threat. His dismissive attitude toward Sarah's insights was obvious, even without understanding his words. The Queen, however, seemed to be considering new possibilities. She asked Sarah several more questions about human problem-solving methods and military strategies. Sarah found herself explaining concepts that were completely foreign to Zephyrian thinking. Ideas like guerrilla warfare, misdirection, and fighting dirty. The Zephyrians seemed to have a very formal, honor-based approach to combat that would be completely useless against machines. As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that she was no longer just an accidental bride or a stranded alien. She was becoming an advisor, a source of new ideas that might help these people survive. Krextol clearly saw this development as a threat to his own position and authority. The hostility in his compound eyes was growing stronger with each suggestion Sarah made. But Queen Zithara seemed increasingly convinced that her accidental human spouse might be exactly what the Zephyrians needed to finally defeat the Endless Hunger. The attack came at dawn 3 days later, just as Sarah was beginning to understand the basic structure of Zephyrian military organization. She had been working with Queen Zithara and Vexilon to analyze their defensive capabilities when the alarm sounds began echoing through the ancient ruins. The musical tones that served as the Zephyrian warning system were unlike anything Sarah had ever heard. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, creating harmonies that made her bones vibrate. Within moments, the ruins filled with the sound of rushing feet and beating wings as warriors took their positions. Sarah followed the Queen to what served as their command center, a vast chamber where crystalline displays showed tactical information in patterns of light that hurt her human eyes to look at directly. Through the displays, she could see the approaching enemy forces. The Endless Hunger had found them. The attacking units looked like a nightmare fusion of organic and mechanical elements. They moved across the landscape in perfect formation, converting everything they touched into more of themselves. Trees withered and became twisted metal structures. Rocks dissolved and reformed into geometric shapes that pulsed with alien energy. Leading the attack were creatures that might once have been living beings, but were now something else entirely. Sarah could see that they retained basic organic shapes but were covered in the same crystalline material she had removed from the Queen's wound. Their movements were too coordinated, too precise to be natural. Commander Krextul stood at the center of the command chamber, giving orders in the formal military language that Sarah was slowly beginning to recognize. His strategy was exactly what she had expected from their earlier conversations: traditional formation flying, direct attacks, honor-based combat tactics that would have worked perfectly against other organic opponents. Against machines that learned and adapted with every encounter, his approach was suicide. The first wave of Zephyrian defenders launched into the air with magnificent coordination. Their wings caught the morning light as they formed up into attack formations that had probably been used for thousands of years. Sarah watched through the displays as they engaged the enemy forces in aerial combat that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. For the first few minutes, it seemed like the traditional tactics might work. The Zephyrian warriors were faster and more maneuverable than the converted creatures. Their weapons, some kind of energy projection system built into their exoskeletons, seemed effective against individual enemies. But then the machine intelligence began to adapt. Sarah watched in horror as the enemy forces changed their behavior in real time. They started moving in new patterns, coordinating their attacks to exploit weaknesses in the Zephyrian formations. What had been individual combat became a coordinated assault by units that shared information instantly across the entire battlefield. The Zephyrian casualties began mounting quickly. Warriors who had survived dozens of battles against organic enemies were overwhelmed by opponents that learned from every attack, that shared knowledge instantly with every other unit on the battlefield. Krextul responded by sending in more forces, larger formations, elite units held in reserve. But Sarah could see that this was exactly what the enemy wanted. Every Zephyrian that engaged in direct combat was teaching the machines more about their capabilities and weaknesses. "This isn't working," Sarah said to Queen Zithara. "Your people are brave, but they're fighting the wrong kind of war." The Queen's compound eyes turned toward her, and Sarah could see the same realization dawning there. Vexilon translated Sarah's words, adding his own analysis of the tactical situation. "Commander Krextul will not listen," the Queen replied through Vexilon. "He believes that honor and courage are enough to defeat any enemy." Sarah watched another wave of Zephyrian warriors launch into the air, heading directly toward an enemy force that was already adapting to counter their specific weapons and flight patterns. It was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance of death. "Honor and courage don't matter if you're dead," Sarah said, "and they definitely don't matter if your entire species gets converted into machines." She moved closer to the tactical displays, trying to understand the full scope of the battlefield. The crystalline technology was completely unlike anything humans had developed, but the basic principles of information display were universal enough for her to grasp the important details. The enemy forces were advancing on multiple fronts, but they seemed to be concentrating their efforts on areas where the Zephyrians were offering the most resistance. This made sense from a learning perspective. They wanted to gather as much tactical data as possible before committing their main forces. "They're studying you," Sarah realized. "Every time your warriors engage them directly, they're learning more about how Zephyrians fight. They're not trying to win this battle. They're trying to understand you well enough to win the war." "Queen." Zithara asked Vexilon to explain this concept more clearly, and Sarah found herself giving an impromptu lecture on adaptive artificial intelligence while watching her new people die in the displays around them. "The machine intelligence doesn't think like organic beings," she explained. "It doesn't care about individual victories or defeats. It just wants to gather enough information to completely overwhelm you when it commits its main forces." Through the displays, Sarah could see that the enemy was holding back significant reserves. This first wave was just a probing attack designed to map Zephyrian capabilities and responses. "So what do you suggest?" the Queen asked. Sarah studied the tactical situation for several more minutes, her mind racing through possibilities. Her medical training had taught her to think systematically about problems, to look for root causes rather than just treating symptoms. "Stop giving them what they want," she said finally. "Stop engaging them directly. Make them come to you on your terms, not theirs." Krextul overheard this conversation and approached them with obvious anger. He spoke rapidly to the Queen in formal military language, gesturing dismissively towards Sarah. Vexilon translated the exchange. Commander Krextul says that retreat is not the Zephyrian way. He says that hiding from enemies brings dishonor to our ancestors and shame to our species. Sarah felt her own anger rising. Your ancestors never fought an enemy that could convert your entire civilization into machines. Honor doesn't mean anything if there's nobody left alive to remember it. The argument that followed was intense even with the language barrier. Krextul clearly saw Sarah's suggestions as cowardice, while she saw his traditional tactics as a form of elaborate suicide. Queen Zithara listened to both sides, watching the tactical displays as more of her people died in honorable but futile, direct engagements with an enemy that grew stronger with every encounter. Finally, the Queen made a decision. She gave orders that caused immediate confusion in the command center. Instead of sending reinforcements to support the warriors already engaged with the enemy, she was ordering a general withdrawal to defensive positions within the ruins. Krextul's reaction was explosive. He argued loudly with the Queen, clearly challenging her decision to follow the advice of an alien who had no understanding of Zephyrian military tradition. But Queen Zithara held firm. Through Vexilon, she explained her reasoning to the command staff. The current tactics were resulting in heavy casualties with no strategic benefit. The enemy was learning more from each engagement than the Zephyrians were achieving through direct combat. Sarah watched as the surviving warriors began falling back toward the ruins, and she saw something that gave her hope. The enemy forces did not immediately pursue. Instead, they seemed to be consolidating their positions and analyzing the data they had gathered. This confirmed her theory. The machine intelligence was more interested in understanding the Zephyrians than in achieving quick tactical victories. Now we need to give them false information, Sarah said. Make them think they understand you when they actually don't. She began explaining concepts that were completely foreign to Zephyrian thinking. Deception tactics, false retreats, feints, and misdirection. Ways to make the enemy waste resources attacking empty positions or preparing for threats that didn't exist. Queen Zithara seemed fascinated by these ideas, but Krextul was openly hostile. The concept of deliberate deception seemed to violate everything he believed about proper military conduct. The tension in the command center was growing worse by the minute. Sarah realized that she wasn't just fighting the external enemy anymore. The real battle was for the soul of Zephyrian military thinking, and Commander Krextul was prepared to fight very hard to preserve the traditional ways, even if those traditional ways got everyone killed. As the first day of the siege continued, Sarah found herself caught between trying to help develop new tactics and dealing with the growing internal conflict among the Zephyrian leadership. But she was beginning to understand something important about the enemy. The machine intelligence might be extremely good at adapting to direct military threats, but it seemed to have trouble understanding concepts like deception and misdirection. Perhaps human creativity was exactly what the Zephyrians needed to survive after all. Sarah woke to the sound of weapons fire much closer than it should have been. The crystalline displays in the command center were flashing urgent warnings in patterns that made her head ache. Through the confusion of rapid Zephyrian voices and alarm harmonics, she realized that something had gone terribly wrong with their defensive plans. Vexilon rushed to her side, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting. "The enemy has broken through the outer perimeter," he explained. "Quickly. They are using new tactics, moving through passages we thought were sealed." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she understood the implications. The machine intelligence had been studying their defensive positions for 3 days, while she and the Queen developed their deception strategies. Apparently, it had learned enough to find weaknesses they didn't even know existed. Queen Zithara stood at the center of the tactical displays, giving rapid orders to her remaining commanders. Sarah could see from the crystalline patterns that they were losing ground on multiple fronts. The enemy forces were moving through the ancient ruins like they had detailed maps of every passage and chamber. "How is this possible?" Sarah asked. "We've been so careful about our defensive positions." The answer came from Commander Krextul, who approached them with a group of his most loyal warriors. His words were too rapid for Sarah to follow, but his tone was clear enough. He was angry, and that anger was directed at her. Vexilon's translation made her blood run cold. Commander Krextool says that someone has been providing information to the enemy. He says the attack patterns are too precise, too well coordinated to be based on observation alone. Sarah stared at Krextool in shock. He thinks I'm a spy? That's insane. I'm the one who's been trying to help you fight these things. But even as she said it, Sarah realized how her situation must look to a suspicious mind. She had appeared on their world at the exact same time the enemy had found them. She had knowledge of the crystalline technology that even the Zephyrians didn't possess. She had been pushing for tactics that went against everything the Zephyrians believed about honorable combat. The argument that followed was the most heated she had witnessed since arriving on this world. Krextool was clearly accusing her of betrayal, while Queen Zythara was defending her. Other commanders took sides, and Sarah found herself at the center of a military crisis that could destroy the Zephyrians even more effectively than the external enemy. The debate was interrupted by an explosion that shook the entire ruin complex. Through the tactical displays, Sarah could see that enemy forces had breached the inner defensive ring and were now fighting in the corridors she had been living in for the past week. Queen Zythara made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of continuing the argument, she ordered an immediate evacuation of the command center. They would fall back to the deepest chambers of the ruins, the ancient ceremonial areas that were considered sacred by Zephyrian culture. As they moved through the twisting passages, Sarah could hear the sounds of battle getting closer. The musical voices of Zephyrian warriors mixed with the mechanical sounds of enemy weapons created a terrible harmony that echoed off the stone walls. They had almost reached the sacred chambers when the ambush happened. A group of converted creatures burst from a side passage that should have been empty. These were not the mechanical units Sarah had seen in the tactical displays, but Zephyrians who had been caught and transformed by the crystalline technology. The sight was horrifying. They retained their basic shape and movements, but their exoskeletons were now covered with the same crystal formation Sarah had removed from the Queen's wound. Their compound eyes glowed with alien light, and their voices had been replaced by mechanical approximations of Zephyrian speech. The converted Zephyrians moved with perfect coordination, surrounding the evacuation group with tactical precision that no organic beings could have achieved. Sarah realized with growing horror that the enemy had not just been studying Zephyrian combat techniques, but had been converting captured warriors to serve as scouts and infiltrators. The battle in the narrow passage was brutal and desperate. Queen Zythara fought alongside her warriors with skills that reminded Sarah why she was not just a political leader, but a military commander. But the converted Zephyrians had all the knowledge and abilities of their original selves, enhanced by machine precision and coordination. Sarah found herself pressed against the stone wall, completely useless in a fight between beings who could fly and had natural weapons built into their bodies. But as she watched the battle, she began to notice something important about the converted enemies. They were fighting with perfect technique, using traditional Zephyrian combat methods with machine efficiency. But they showed no creativity, no adaptation to unexpected situations. When Queen Zythara used an unconventional attack pattern, the converted warriors seemed confused for crucial seconds. "They're still thinking like machines," Sarah shouted over the sound of combat. "They can copy your techniques, but they can't improvise." Her words reached Queen Zythara just as the Queen was being pressed back by 3 converted attackers. Instead of using traditional defensive patterns, the Queen suddenly changed tactics, using some of the deception techniques Sarah had suggested days earlier. The effect was immediate. The converted warriors had no programmed response to tactics that violated traditional Zephyrian combat doctrine. Their perfect coordination faltered as they tried to process responses to attacks they had never been taught to counter. The tide of the battle shifted quickly after that. Once the surviving Zephyrian warriors understood that unconventional tactics could confuse the converted enemies, they began fighting with a creativity that no machine intelligence could predict or counter. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Several more warriors had been lost, and worse, Sarah realized that Commander Krextool was no longer with them. Queen Zythara seemed to notice his absence at the same time Sarah did. Through Vexilon, she asked the surviving warriors about the commander's fate. The answer was disturbing. Krextel had not been killed or converted during the battle. He had disappeared during the early stages of the fight, slipping away through passages that only someone with detailed knowledge of the ruins could have navigated. Sarah felt a chill of understanding as the implications became clear. Krextel had not just been arguing against her tactical suggestions because of military tradition. He had been working actively to undermine the Zephyrian defense, possibly feeding information to the enemy in exchange for promises of power or survival. The betrayal explained how the enemy forces had been able to navigate the ruins so effectively, how they had known exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage. Krextel had been providing them with detailed intelligence about Zephyrian positions and capabilities. Queen Zithara's reaction to this realization was quiet but intense. She spoke to her remaining commanders in formal language that Sarah was beginning to recognize as ceremonial pronouncements. Vexlon explained what the Queen had declared. Commander Krextel is now considered an enemy of our people. Any warrior who encounters him is authorized to treat him as a hostile force. But Sarah realized that the immediate problem was not Krextel's betrayal, but what information he might still be providing to the enemy. If he had access to their current location and defensive plans, the sacred chambers would become a trap rather than a refuge. As if to confirm her fears, the mechanical sounds of approaching enemy forces began echoing through the passages leading to their current position. The converted Zephyrians might have been defeated, but they had accomplished their mission of locating the evacuation group. Sarah looked around at the exhausted warriors and the ancient ceremonial chamber that was supposed to be their last refuge. The crystalline formations on the walls seemed to pulse with their own light, and she realized that there was something different about this place. The crystals here were not the same as the enemy technology. These formations seemed older, more complex, and somehow more alive than the mechanical precision of the endless hunger. An idea began forming in her mind, crazy and desperate, but possibly their only chance for survival. Queen Zithara, Sarah said urgently, I need to understand something about these chambers. Are those crystal formations natural to this world, or did your people create them? The answer would determine whether they had stumbled into a trap or discovered the key to finally fighting back against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Queen Zithara's answer changed everything. Sarah thought she understood about this world and the war they were fighting. Through Vexilon's careful translation, Sarah learned that the crystal formations in the sacred chambers were not created by the Zephyrians at all. They were remnants of an ancient civilization that had once lived on this world, a people who had fought the endless hunger thousands of years ago and somehow managed to drive it away. The Zephyrians had discovered these chambers when they first arrived on the planet as refugees. They had declared them sacred not just because of their beauty, but because the crystal formations seemed to have a protective effect against the crystalline technology of their enemies. Sarah moved closer to examine the ancient crystals, her medical training helping her notice details that others might miss. These formations were not just different from the enemy technology. They seemed to actively oppose it. Where the enemy crystals were precise and geometric, these were organic and flowing. Where the machine crystals pulsed with cold light, these emanated a warm glow that felt somehow alive. The original inhabitants of this world must have found a way to fight back, Sarah realized. These crystals aren't just protective, they're weapons. But as she studied the formations more closely, Sarah began to understand why the ancient weapons had not been enough to save their creators. The crystal technology was incredibly complex, requiring some kind of biological interface to activate properly. The Zephyrians had never been able to make it work because their physiology was not compatible with the control systems. The sound of approaching enemy forces was getting louder, echoing through the passages that led to the sacred chambers. Sarah could hear the mechanical precision of their movements mixed with something else that made her blood run cold. Commander Krextel's voice was directing them, providing tactical guidance based on his intimate knowledge of Zephyrian defensive positions. Queen Zithara gathered her remaining warriors in a defensive formation around the chamber's entrance, but Sarah could see that they were hopelessly outnumbered. Even with their new understanding of how to fight converted Zephyrians, they would not be able to hold their position for more than a few minutes, unless the ancient weapons could be made to work. Sarah placed her hand on the largest crystal formation, trying to understand how the interface system functioned. The moment her skin made contact with the alien technology, she felt a surge of information flowing into her mind. Images, sensations, and knowledge that was not her own but somehow felt familiar. She saw the ancient civilization that had created these weapons. They were not so different from humans, bipedal beings with similar neural patterns and biological systems. The crystals had been designed to work with their specific brain chemistry, creating a symbiotic relationship between organic intelligence and crystalline technology. But the interface was not just about compatibility. It required something else, something that Sarah was only beginning to understand. The ancient weapons drew their power from the chaotic, unpredictable nature of organic consciousness. They needed creativity, emotion, and the kind of random neural activity that machine intelligence could not replicate or counter. Sarah realized with growing excitement that human brain patterns might be exactly what the ancient weapons needed to function again. The first enemy forces appeared at the chamber entrance just as Sarah began to understand how to activate the crystal systems. Commander Krextool led a mixed group of mechanical units and converted Zephyrians, his compound eyes glowing with the same alien light that marked all servants of the endless hunger. He had been converted himself. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Krextool had not just betrayed his own people for promises of power, he had allowed himself to be transformed by the enemy, trading his independence and identity for the cold efficiency of machine consciousness. When he spoke, his voice was still recognizably his own, but the words carried the mechanical precision of the collective intelligence that now controlled him. "Queen Zythara," he said in perfect formal Zephyrian, "you have fought bravely, but your resistance is futile. The endless hunger offers you the chance to join your people in perfect unity. No more pain, no more uncertainty, no more death. Only the peace of absolute order." The Queen's response was everything Sarah had come to expect from her. Proud, defiant, and absolutely unwilling to surrender her people's freedom for the promise of machine perfection. "We choose the chaos of life over the peace of death," she declared. "We choose uncertainty over slavery." The battle that followed was unlike anything Sarah had witnessed before. The enemy forces moved with perfect coordination, their attacks timed to the microsecond. But the Zephyrian defenders fought with desperate creativity, using every unconventional tactic Sarah had taught them. While the battle raged around her, Sarah pressed both hands against the ancient crystal formation and opened her mind to its alien intelligence. The sensation was overwhelming at first, like trying to drink from a waterfall, but gradually she began to understand the flow of information. The crystal weapons were not just tools, but living things, organic technology that had evolved alongside the civilization that created them. They had been waiting for thousands of years for someone with the right kind of consciousness to awaken them again. Sarah felt her awareness expanding beyond her own body, connecting with crystal formations throughout the chamber and beyond. The entire ruin complex was part of a vast network, a defensive system that covered hundreds of square kilometers. But activating the weapons required more than just the right neural patterns. It required a deliberate choice, a conscious decision to accept the responsibility that came with such power. Sarah understood now why the ancient civilization had ultimately fallen despite their advanced weapons. The temptation to use such technology for conquest rather than defense had corrupted them, turning their protective systems into instruments of expansion and control. She could feel that same temptation now, the intoxicating possibility of unlimited power flowing through crystalline networks that could reshape entire worlds. But she also felt the weight of choice, the understanding that how she used this power would determine not just the fate of this battle, but the future of every species that encountered the endless hunger. Sarah made her decision. Instead of using the crystal weapons to destroy the enemy forces, she configured them to do something the machine intelligence could never expect or counter. The ancient technology began broadcasting a signal that disrupted the collective consciousness of the endless hunger, not by attacking it directly, but by introducing chaos into its perfect order. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The converted Zephyrians stopped mid-attack, their mechanical precision replaced by confusion as their individual consciousness began reasserting itself. The machine units began malfunctioning as their coordination networks collapsed under the weight of random neural static. Commander Krextool staggered as the alien control systems in his body fought against the disruption signal. For a moment, his original personality flickered back into his compound eyes, and Sarah saw the horror of what he had become. But the real victory was not the defeat of this one attack force. The crystal network was broadcasting the disruption signal across vast distances, reaching every world where the endless hunger had established a presence. Across the galaxy, converted beings were breaking free from machine control, and the collective consciousness that had seemed unstoppable was fragmenting into chaos. Queen Zithara approached Sarah as the last enemy units shut down around them. The Queen's compound eyes held a mixture of gratitude and understanding that needed no translation. "You have given us more than victory," Vexilon translated her words. "You have given us hope." Sarah looked around at the ancient crystal formations that were now pulsing with renewed life, their warm glow spreading through passages that had been dark for millennia. She understood that this was just the beginning. The disruption signal would not destroy the endless hunger permanently, but it would give the galaxy's organic species the chance to fight back on equal terms. The accidental marriage that had started with a simple act of medical care had become the foundation for a new kind of alliance, not just between two individuals, but between species who chose cooperation over conquest, healing over destruction. Sarah realized that her role as an accidental queen was just beginning. The galaxy would need someone who understood both the power of the ancient weapons and the responsibility that came with using them. Someone who could help forge alliances between species who had never worked together before. Someone who chose to heal rather than harm, even when offered the power to reshape worlds. The endless hunger was far from defeated, but for the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy's organic species had a real chance to win the war.